The knock came just after midnight, 3 hard strikes against pine wood that Jeremiah Turner felt in his chest before he even heard them with his ears. And for a long moment he lay perfectly still beneath his wool blankets and told himself he had imagined it. He had not imagined it. The second set of knocks came harder, more desperate, and Jeremiah sat upright in the darkness of his bedroom, the cold air of the Wyoming Territory December biting at his bare forearms as he pushed aside the blankets. The fire in the main room had burned down to embers hours ago. He could see his own breath rising in faint white curls in the moonlight that filtered through the frosted window glass. Outside, the wind was doing what Wyoming wind always did in the deep of winter. It was trying to tear the world apart at its seams. The snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, and by the sound of it now, thick and heavy and continuous, it had not slowed one bit. Jeremiah pulled on his trousers and his boots and his heavy wool shirt, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 7 years alone and had grown accustomed to dressing in the dark without anyone to speak to or disturb. He took his lantern from the bedside table, lit it with a match from the tin on the shelf, and carried it through the dark hallway toward the front door. He was 34 years old, built broad and hard from a decade and a half of ranch work, with dark hair that had just begun to thread through with silver at the temples, and a jaw that carried 3 days of beard at almost all times. His hands were the hands of a man who had never in his life done work that didn't leave marks on him. He was not, by any honest measure, a man who looked like he needed softening. But in his eyes, if you looked carefully enough and the light was right, there was something that hadn't entirely gone hard yet, something that 7 years of grief and silence had pushed down deep, but had never quite managed to extinguish. He reached the front door and stood with his hand on the iron latch and listened. The wind howled. Snow struck the boards of the porch with a sound like scattered gravel, and beneath all of that, barely audible, he heard something that made the hair on his arm stand straight up beneath his shirt sleeves. A voice, a woman's voice, saying something he could not make out through the door and the storm and the 7 years of silence that had calcified around his heart like stone. He threw back the latch and pulled the door open. She was standing on his porch in a coat that had not been built for Wyoming winters, her dark hair plastered against her face by the snow, her lips gone bluish-white with cold, and her eyes, a striking shade of amber that caught the lantern light even through the ice crystals on her lashes, were locked onto his with an expression that held equal parts relief and mortification. As though she was deeply ashamed to be standing on a stranger's porch in the middle of a blizzard, but was also too cold to go back to being proud about it. She was holding a small leather traveling bag in one hand and clutching the porch railing with the other, and Jeremiah could see that her knuckles were the same bluish-white as her lips. She said, "I am sorry to trouble you. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back and then bolted. I have been walking in this storm for nearly 2 hours. I saw your light." She paused and took a breath that visibly hurt her. "I am terribly, terribly sorry. I know it is the middle of the night." Jeremiah Turner stood in his doorway and looked at her. He had not spoken a woman's name in 7 years. He had not needed to. He had his ranch hand, a 22-year-old Lakota man named Chayton who worked the horses and the cattle with him and who slept in the bunkhouse 20 yards from the main house. He had the men at Dunnigan's General Store in the small town of Harrow Creek, 8 miles south. He had the circuit preacher who came through twice a year. He had, occasionally, the cattle buyers from Cheyenne. He had silence. He had learned to live inside it the way a man learns to breathe through a wound, not comfortably, but steadily, as a matter of simple survival. He had not spoken a woman's name since the night Margaret died. He stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by disuse and the cold, and he saw her flinch slightly at the sound of it, as though she had not been entirely certain until that moment that he was capable of speech. But she came inside, stepping past him with her bag clutched against her chest, and he closed the door behind her and shut out the screaming of the storm. She stood in the middle of his main room and shook. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical trembling of a woman who wanted attention, but with the deep, involuntary, bone-level shaking of a body that had been pushed well past its limits and was only now beginning to register what it had survived. Her coat dripped steadily onto his floorboards. Her boots were soaked through. He could see the skin of her hands in the lantern light, and it alarmed him the color had gone out of her fingers entirely. "Sit down," he said, already moving toward the fireplace. "Right there, nearest to the hearth." She sat in the wooden chair he indicated, pulling her wet coat tighter around herself out of habit, and watched him with those amber eyes as he crouched before the fireplace and began to work at rebuilding the fire with the quick, practiced movements of a man who had rebuilt that same fire 10,000 times. He laid the tinder, struck the match, coaxed the flame from nothing into something, added the split pine that would catch fastest, and then the larger pieces of oak that would hold through the night. In 3 minutes there was a proper fire burning, and the room began to slowly, reluctantly surrender its cold. He stood and turned back to her. "Your hands," he said. "Let me see them." She hesitated for just a moment, the hesitation of a woman who was not accustomed to accepting things from strangers, or perhaps from anyone, and then she held them out. He crouched before her chair and took her hands in both of his and looked at the fingers. Not frostbitten, not yet, but close enough to it that his jaw tightened. He held her hands between his and rubbed them, slow and steady, generating friction and warmth. She made a sharp sound of pain as feeling began to return to her fingers, and he said, "That means it's working. Hold still." "I am holding still," she said, and there was a thread of dry humor in it despite the pain and the cold and the utterly improbable circumstances, and something in him registered that unexpectedly. "What's your name?" he asked, still working at her hands. She looked at him for a moment before she answered. "Augusta," she said. "Augusta Grady, Augusta." He hadn't thought a woman's name could land on him like that anymore, like something thrown from a distance that surprised you by arriving. "Jeremiah Turner," he said. "This is my ranch." "I know," she said. "I mean, I didn't know your name, but I saw the light from the road and I could see it was a ranch. I nearly missed it in the storm. Another quarter-mile and I don't know what I would have done." He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that another quarter-mile in that storm, in those clothes, with those hands, would have been a serious matter. He just kept rubbing warmth back into her fingers. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Harrow Creek," she said. "I was coming from the stage stop at Millbrook. I had planned to ride into town tonight, take a room at the boarding house, and present myself to the land office first thing in the morning." She paused. "I have purchased a parcel of land." He looked up at her then, momentarily surprised out of the methodical work of warming her hands. "You've purchased land near Harrow Creek. 40 acres, she said. "The Dawson parcel, if you know it, on the east side of the creek." He did know it. He knew every acre within 20 miles of his ranch. The Dawson parcel was good land, better than most people gave it credit for, with natural windbreaks from the tree line to the north and access to the creek year-round. Old Frank Dawson had let it go to seed in the last years of his life, but the bones of the land were solid. "I know it," Jeremiah said. He released her hands and straightened up and went to the kitchen. He had coffee from that morning that he could reheat, and he found the pot on the back of the iron stove and moved it to the heat. He pulled down a tin mug from the shelf. Then he went to the cupboard where he kept the extra quilts. Margaret had made them both 7 years ago, and he had not touched the second one since, and he took it down and carried it back to the main room. He held it out to her without ceremony. She looked at it and then at him. "It's a quilt," he said, because she seemed to be waiting for some additional explanation. She took it and pulled it around her shoulders, and some of the blue left her lips, and color began to come back into her face by degrees, chased in by the fire's warmth. He went back to the kitchen and poured the reheated coffee and brought it to her. She wrapped both hands around the mug. Her hands were still shaking, but less now, and looked up at him with an expression that was undefended in a way that caught him off guard. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that genuinely. I was in real trouble out there." "I know," he said. He pulled the other wooden chair to the opposite side of the fireplace and sat down. He looked at her across the fire. She was, he thought, somewhere in her late 20s, 28 or 29, perhaps, with a face that had been made for a different kind of life than Wyoming winters and thrown horseshoes. Or perhaps it had been made exactly for that kind of life, and just hadn't gotten to it yet. Her dark hair, drying now in the heat of the fire, was beginning to take on a wave. Her amber eyes caught the firelight and held it. She was not fragile, he could see that already. There was a steadiness to her beneath the shaking and the cold that he recognized because he had tried for 7 years to cultivate that same quality in himself. "Where did you come from before Millbrook?" he asked. "Kansas," she said. "Wichita most recently. Before that, Ohio." "I came out to Kansas with my father's family 6 years ago." She took a careful sip of the coffee and closed her eyes briefly, as though it was the finest thing she had ever tasted. "My father died last spring. He left me a small amount of money. Not enough to stay comfortable in Wichita, not as a woman alone, but enough to start something, somewhere that was still opening up. Wyoming Territory opened up a few years back," he said. "I read about the land office opening in Harrow Creek," she said. "And I read about the Dawson parcel specifically in a letter from a man named Holt, who runs the land office there. He described it in terms that were encouraging." She looked at him carefully. "Is it as good as he described?" "Better," Jeremiah said honestly. "If you know what you're doing with land." She held his gaze. "I know what I'm doing with land." He believed her. He was not sure why he believed her so quickly, except that her eyes did not have the quality of someone making a claim they weren't sure of. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire between them, the storm outside working itself into a genuine fury. The walls of the house creaked under the wind's pressure, and somewhere in the distance Jeremiah heard one of his horses calling out in the barn. The sound carried even through the storm and the thick log walls, and he stood automatically. "Your horses," she said. "My ranch hand sleeps in the bunkhouse," he said. "He'll see to them, but I need to check." He paused. "You'll be all right here for a few minutes." It was not quite a question, but she answered it anyway. "I'll be fine," she said. "Go." He pulled on his heavy coat and his hat and went out through the back of the house toward the barn, leaning into the wind with the practiced forward lean of a man who had walked that same path through hundreds of Wyoming storms. The snow was up to his boot tops in drifts against the fence, and the cold was something alive and mean, looking for bare skin to punish. He moved quickly. In the barn, Chayton was already there, lantern in hand, moving between the stalls with the calm, unhurried competence that Jeremiah had come to rely on absolutely over the 3 years the young man had worked for him. Chayton was 22, lean and dark-eyed and almost constitutionally averse to unnecessary speech, which had suited Jeremiah perfectly. "All settled," Chayton said without turning from the mare he was checking. "Something spooked them, maybe a branch come down on the roof." "There was a woman," Jeremiah said, "stranded on the road. She's inside the house." Chayton did turn then, with an expression of undisguised surprise that Jeremiah noted without comment. "She'll stay the night," Jeremiah continued, as though it were a perfectly ordinary arrangement. "Storm won't clear until morning at the earliest." "All right," Chayton said after a pause, and then, "You need anything?" "No," Jeremiah said. "Get some sleep." He went back to the house. Augusta Grady had removed her wet coat while he was gone and draped it near the fire. She was still wrapped in the quilt, but her color had come back fully now, and she was sitting straight in the chair rather than hunched against the cold, and she had refilled her own coffee from the pot on the hearth, which he noticed because it suggested she was the sort of person who did not wait to be waited upon. "Your horses are all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said. He hung his coat by the door and came back to the fire. Outside, a gust of wind hit the house hard enough to rattle the window in its frame. "The storm's going to hold through the night. You'll need to sleep here." He expected her to argue or at least to perform some social discomfort about the impropriety of it. She did neither. "I expected as much," she said. "I hope it isn't too great an inconvenience. I'm aware that you weren't expecting company." "There's a bedroom at the end of the hall," he said. "I'll get you sheets." Please don't go to any trouble. A blanket and the chair would be more than sufficient." "There are 2 bedrooms," he said quietly. "One of them isn't used." She looked at him. He held her gaze steadily because he had said it plainly and he was not going to qualify it. After a moment she nodded. "That's very kind," she said. "Thank you." He went and made up the spare bedroom Margaret sighed, though he never thought of it in those terms anymore. He thought of it as simply the other room with sheets from the chest at the foot of the bed and the second spare quilt from the hall closet. The room was cold and he stood in the doorway for a moment afterward, looking at it in the lantern light, and felt nothing specific, which was its own kind of progress, he supposed, after 7 years. He went back to the main room and told her the room was ready. She stood with the quilt still around her shoulders and picked up her leather bag and paused before she left the firelight. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, not uncertainty exactly, but something careful, something that was paying close attention. "You didn't ask me anything else," she said. He frowned slightly. "About what?" "About whether I was who I said I was. About whether the land purchase was real. About what a woman alone was doing traveling a road like that in December." She was watching him with those amber eyes. "Most men would have asked." "Most men," he said, "would have decided before they opened the door." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good night, Mr. Turner." "Good night, Miss Grady," he said. And she went down the hall, and he stood alone in the firelight and listened to the storm. And for the first time in 7 years, the silence of his house felt different. Not better necessarily, just different. Like a room where a window has been opened that had been shut for a long time. The air that comes through is cold, but it is air. He sat in the chair by the fire for a long time before he slept. In the morning, the storm had burned itself out sometime before dawn, and Jeremiah rose at his usual hour, which was 4:30, and dressed and went to the kitchen to start the stove fire and begin breakfast. He was not a man who cooked with any particular art, but he was competent beans, bacon, cornbread, coffee, because a man who worked a ranch alone either learned to feed himself adequately or he suffered. He did not expect Augusta Grady to be awake. He had made enough noise coming through the house that if she were a light sleeper she would have heard him, but he assumed she was exhausted from the night before, and that he would be done with breakfast and out to the barn before she stirred. She was in the kitchen doorway at 4:55, already dressed, her dark hair pinned up though a few curls had escaped at the temples, looking at him with the expression of a woman who had also, for some time, been her own company in the mornings. "You're up early," he said, without turning from the stove. "I'm always up early," she said. "May I help?" He glanced back. She had already moved to the table and was looking at the supplies on it with the practical eye of someone who was already calculating what needed to be done. "Cornbread," he said, and pointed to the tin of cornmeal and the eggs on the table. She made the cornbread without asking him where anything was. She simply found it, moving through his kitchen with the methodical confidence of a woman who had navigated unfamiliar kitchens before. He watched her out of the corner of his eye, and then stopped watching and focused on the bacon and the beans. They ate at the kitchen table as the gray pre-dawn light began to soften the frost on the window glass. The food was plain and hot, and the coffee was strong, and neither of them said much, but it was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people who were comfortable enough already to sit quietly together, which was a different and considerably rarer thing. After breakfast, she insisted on doing the washing up. He argued with her for exactly one exchange and then let her do it, because she was clearly not going to be deterred, and because he had learned a long time ago that there was a particular kind of woman, the kind his grandmother had been, the kind he suspected Margaret had been in the years before he knew her, who found insult in being prevented from contributing. He went to the barn and worked alongside Chayton through the morning, checking the animals for cold weather injuries, breaking the ice on the water troughs, reinforcing the fence along the north pasture where the snow had put pressure on the posts. It was hard, cold, necessary work, and it occupied his hands and part of his mind, But the other part of his mind, the part he was less practiced at managing, kept returning to the woman in his kitchen, to the sound of her voice. Augusta. The way it had landed on him. He did not examine it closely. He was not, by temperament or by years of practice, a man who spent a great deal of time examining his interior landscape. He pushed the awareness of it to one side and drove another fence post and told Chayton to check the south pasture gate. At mid-morning, he came back to the house to find that Augusta had swept the main room and stacked the split wood that had been cluttering the porch into a neat pile against the exterior wall. She was standing on the porch when he came around the corner of the house, looking south toward the road, which was now buried under 14 inches of fresh snow. She turned when she heard him. "How long before the road to Harrow Creek is passable?" she asked. He looked at the sky, at the snow, at the direction of the wind. "Tomorrow," he said, "maybe the day after. The road crew from town won't come out this far until it's been clear for a day at least, and your horse is gone." She absorbed this with the same steadiness she seemed to bring to everything. "Then I'll wait," she said. She looked at him. "I don't want to be a burden to you." "You've already swept my floor and stacked my wood," he said. "You're not a burden." A small smile crossed her face there and then carefully gone. "I don't know how to sit still and do nothing useful," she said. "I apologize in advance." "I don't sit still either," he said, "so we should get along fine." He said it before he thought about whether he meant it, and then, because it was already said, he let it stand. The day moved forward. He showed her the property in the afternoon, which he did partly because she asked and partly because he found he wanted to, walking her out through the knee-deep snow of the south field and along the fence line and down to the creek, which ran dark and fast beneath a skin of ice at its edges. He told her about the land, how he'd come to Wyoming territory in 1876, nearly 10 years ago now, with his wife and $100 and 2 horses, and the intention of building something real. How the ranch had grown from 40 head to 220. How the land itself had shaped everything he'd done, demanded things of him that he hadn't known he was capable of giving. He did not mention Margaret's name. He was not ready to. But he mentioned her obliquely, in the way a man mentions a missing thing by talking around the shape of the space it left. Augusta walked beside him through the snow, wearing his wife's old barn coat that he'd found in the chest without examining too closely why he was offering it, and she listened with the genuine attention of someone who found what he was saying interesting rather than just being polite. "You love this place," she said, at the fence line. "Yes," he said simply. "I understand that," she said. "I've been moving for 6 years. Ohio to Kansas, Kansas to here, or close enough to here. I want to stop moving. I want to put something in the ground and watch it take." She looked out over the snow-covered expanse of his south field with something fierce in her amber eyes. "The Dawson parcel has a creek frontage," the letter said. "It does," he said. "Good water deep in summer." "What would you run on 40 acres?" she asked. "If it were yours." He thought about it. "Cattle, if you've got the capital for a starting herd. But the Dawson parcel is narrow enough along the south end that horses might suit it better. 24 horses, well-bred, sold to the cavalry or the ranchers coming in from the east. There's good money in it right now. The territory is still filling up and everybody needs horses." He paused. "But I don't know what you know how to do." "My father ran horses," she said, "in Ohio and again in Kansas. I can ride, I can handle a foal, I can assess a horse's soundness. I'm not romantic about animals, but I have genuine respect for them." She paused. "Also, I can mend fence and fire a rifle with reasonable accuracy." "That'll matter," he said. "I know it will," she said. They stood at the fence line for a moment, looking out at the white Wyoming world, and the cold was sharp and clean, and the sky was that deep blue that only comes in winter in the high country, and Jeremiah Turner felt something shift in him with the subtle, significant movement of tectonic plates, not dramatic, not sudden, but real and impossible to ignore once you noticed it. He noticed it. He did not say anything about it. They walked back to the house. That evening, after supper, she had taken over the cooking entirely, producing from his sparse larder a beef stew that was considerably better than anything he'd made in recent memory. They sat by the fire again. Chayton had come to the back door at supper time, as was his habit, and Jeremiah had brought him a bowl, and the young man had glanced once at Augusta at the stove with an expression of carefully suppressed curiosity and then taken his bowl and gone back to the bunkhouse without comment. "Your ranch hand," Augusta said, settling into her chair by the fire. "He's been with you long." 3 years, Jeremiah said. "He's a good worker, better than good." "He looked at me like I had come down from the moon," she said without rancor. Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. "He probably did," he said. "This house hasn't had a woman in it since he stopped." She waited. He had spent 7 years not finishing sentences like that one. He had gotten very good at finding the cutoff point and steering around it, but something about the firelight or the way she waited without pressing him made him continue. "Since my wife died," he said. 7 years ago." The words sat in the room between them. He felt the weight of them, familiar and worn as river stones, and he waited for the expression that always came when he told people, the careful sympathy, the slightly too large eyes, the modified tone of voice that people took on around grief. Augusta Grady looked at him with none of that. She looked at him the same way she had looked at him since she arrived, which was to say directly and with something close to equality in it. "I'm sorry," she said, and the 2 words were exactly the right size. Not too big, not too small, not adorned. "It was 7 years ago," he said, which was what he always said and which did not mean anything coherent, but she seemed to understand what it was covering. "My mother died when I was 12, she said. People always expected that to stop being something at some point. It never did." He looked at her across the fire. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't stop." They sat with that for a while. Outside the wind was quiet tonight, the storm fully past, and the world under its snow covering was still and muffled, and the only sounds were the fire and the occasional settling of the log walls in the cold, and far away, a coyote calling once and then going silent. "Do you mind my asking about her?" Augusta said. "You don't have to answer." He had not talked about Margaret, not truly, not honestly, in 7 years. The few times someone had brought her up, he had given them the outline of the story: fever, winter, fast at the end, and then closed the subject. He had become expert at closing the subject. He looked at Augusta Grady in the firelight and said, "Her name was Margaret. She came to Wyoming with me from Missouri. She thought it was going to be an adventure, and she was right for a while." He paused. "She got sick in the winter of 1879. It went fast. I brought the doctor from Harrow Creek, but the roads were bad, and by the time he arrived, he stopped again." Augusta said nothing. She didn't try to fill the pause. "She was 30 years old, he said. We had not yet had children. We had always said there was time." He looked at the fire. "There wasn't." "No," Augusta said very quietly. "There usually isn't as much time as we think." He cleared his throat and straightened. "What about you?" he asked, and he knew he was redirecting, but she knew it too and allowed him to do it, which he was grateful for. "What about me?" she said. "Were you ever married?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I was engaged once in Kansas. A man named Whitmore. He was a decent man, genuinely decent, which I want to give him credit for, but he wanted something very specific for a wife. Something I couldn't be." She met his eyes. "He wanted someone who would be content to be still, to stay inside the circumference of what he defined as a woman's life. And she paused. "I simply couldn't. I tried for almost a year to be that person, and then I stopped trying, and we both knew what that meant." "You don't strike me as someone who would tolerate that for long," he said. She looked at him with a sharp, surprised look, as though she had not expected him to see that so clearly. "No," she said, "I don't suppose I do." The fire crackled. A log shifted and sent up a shower of sparks. "You came here alone," he said. It was not a criticism. It was something more like admiration, though he would not have said that aloud. "I came here alone," she confirmed. "On purpose. The land is in my name. The decision is mine. Whatever comes of it, good or bad, it will be mine." She paused. "I'm aware that some people here won't think well of that. of a woman alone trying to run land in Wyoming territory. Some won't, he agreed, but this territory gave women the vote in 1869. It's ahead of most places. Having the right to vote and being accepted as a landowner are two different things, she said, with a dry humor that had an edge of genuine frustration in it. I know what I'm walking into. I've done my reading. I believe you, he said. And again, he meant it before he thought about whether he meant it. The second day of her stay, she was up before him. He came to the kitchen at 4:30 and found the stove already lit and coffee already on and Augusta at the kitchen table writing in a small notebook by lantern light, making notes that, when he glanced without intention at the page, appeared to be a list of supplies and priorities and calculations about the Dawson parcel. She looked up at him without self-consciousness. I hope I didn't disturb you. You didn't, he said, and poured himself coffee and sat across the table from her. What are you planning? She turned the notebook so he could see it properly, and for the next hour they sat across the kitchen table and talked through the logistics of establishing a small horse operation on 40 acres in Wyoming territory in the winter of 1885. He answered her questions about suppliers and feed costs and the reliability of the roads in different seasons. She asked intelligent questions and absorbed the answers without wasted time. She had already thought of most of the problems and was working on solutions. He found himself telling her about the trade routes and the cavalry contracts and the names of the good farriers in the region, and which ranch hands in the area were looking for part-time work, and the politics of the Harrow Creek Town Council, and the location of the nearest reliable doctor, which was a subject he had specific and painful knowledge of. She listened to all of it and wrote notes in her small, precise handwriting. At some point during that hour the sun came up and poured orange winter light through the kitchen window and lit up the frost crystals on the glass in a brief, incandescent display, and Jeremiah Turner was in the middle of saying something about the north-facing pasture on the Dawson parcel and the importance of windbreak fencing, and he stopped mid-sentence and looked at Augusta Grady in the morning light and felt, very clearly and without the ability to rationalize it away, that he did not want her to leave. He finished his sentence. He did not say what he had felt. He took his coffee and went to the barn, but the feeling followed him. That afternoon, Chayton came to Jeremiah at the fence line where he was restringing wire and said, with the directness that Jeremiah had always valued in him, "The woman's staying in the house." "Miss Grady," Jeremiah said. Chayton nodded. "She came out to the barn this morning while you were checking the south pasture." Jeremiah paused in his work. "She asked about the bay mare," Chayton continued. "The one with the tendon trouble. She looked at the leg properly. She knew what she was doing with it." He paused. "She suggested using a cold water treatment and a particular wrap. I had not thought of that combination. I tried it." He paused again. "It worked." Jeremiah looked at his ranch hand. Chayton said nothing more. He did not need to. On the third day, the road was passable. Jeremiah rode out early to check it himself. The snow had been packed down by a light wind overnight, and the sun was out, and the road south to Harrow Creek was navigable for a horse and rider, though it would not take a wagon for another day. He came back to the house and told Augusta, and watched something move across her face that she controlled almost immediately into a neutral expression. "I'll need to hire a horse to get to town," she said. "You can take one of mine," he said. "I'll ride with you. The road is clear, but you don't know the terrain and some of the drifts hide ruts." She looked at him. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to," he said. Another moment of her watching him with that careful amber gaze. Then, "All right," she said. They rode out after breakfast, Jeremiah on his black gelding and Augusta on the bay mare, not the one with the healing tendon but the second bay, a steady and good-tempered animal. Augusta sat a horse with the ease of someone who had been riding since before she could name it as a skill, and he found himself riding slightly behind her on the narrow sections of road, just to watch her handle the mare through the snow drifts with the light, confident touch of an experienced rider. The road south was beautiful in the winter morning. The snow lay in clean, unbroken sheets across the fields on either side, and the sky was the color of a blue-eyed dog, clear and deep, and the mountains to the west were pink in the low sun. The cold was serious but manageable, and the horses moved well through it. They talked, riding side by side on the wider sections. She asked him about the other ranches he could see from the road, and he told her their stories, who had made it, who hadn't, what had made the difference. He told her about the O'Hara family, who had come out in 1878 with nothing, and built a successful operation through sheer stubbornness. He told her about the Beckett brothers, who had made a series of catastrophically bad decisions, and were now back in Ohio. He told her about the Edwards family's troubles with the land claim dispute, and how it had dragged through the territorial court for 3 years. She was quiet for a moment after the Edwards story, and then said, "That's one thing I've been careful about, making absolutely certain the title on the Dawson parcel is clean before I signed anything. I had Mr. Holt send me copies of the deed records." "Smart," he said. "Not smart," she said. "Necessary. I couldn't afford a mistake." She said it plainly, without self-pity, and he understood that she meant it in both the financial and the personal sense. That she was out here alone, and a mistake would fall entirely on her, and she had calibrated herself accordingly. Harrow Creek came into view as they crested the last low hill, a small collection of buildings along both sides of the main street, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the false fronts of the shops dusted with snow and looking exactly as they always looked in winter, which was to say like a collection of structures that were doing their determined best to be a town and mostly succeeding. He rode with her to the land office first, where a thin, meticulous man named Holt shook her hand and examined her papers, and confirmed that the Dawson parcel transaction was complete and that she was, as of 30 minutes ago, the sole legal owner of 40 acres in Wyoming territory. And the look on Augusta's face when Holt handed her the completed deed was something that Jeremiah Turner, standing by the door with his hat in his hand, did not think he would easily forget. It was not triumphant exactly. It was something deeper than triumph, the look of a person who has been working towards something for long enough that the arrival of it is both exactly what they expected and utterly surprising. Quiet joy and quiet relief, and underneath both of those, something like bedrock, like a foundation being poured. He looked away and studied the floorboards of the land office because looking at her felt, in that moment, like too private a thing. From the land office they went to the general store, where Augusta bought a list of immediate necessities: food, lamp oil, a pair of work gloves, a proper winter coat that was built for Wyoming rather than Kansas, with the careful efficiency of a woman who knew exactly what she needed and what she could afford, and was not spending 1 penny beyond the line between those two things. Ben Dunnigan, who ran the store and who had served Jeremiah's supply needs for 10 years, watched Augusta Grady move through his shop with barely concealed curiosity. When she stepped away to examine the quality of the dry goods, Dunnigan leaned across the counter and said to Jeremiah in a low voice, "She's staying long." "She's bought the Dawson parcel," Jeremiah said. Dunnigan's eyebrows went up considerably. "She's going to run horses," Jeremiah added. The eyebrows went higher. Then Dunnigan looked at him with an expression that Jeremiah chose not to interpret. "Huh," Dunnigan said and went back to his ledger. They ate midday dinner at the single eating establishment in Harrow Creek, a narrow room with 6 tables run by a woman named Mrs. Peel, who made serviceable beef stew and excellent pie. Augusta ate with appetite, which he had noticed about her from the first morning. She was not delicate about food. She ate because she was hungry, and she was always hungry because she was always working, and there was something about that he found unexpectedly pleasant to observe. The other 2 tables in Mrs. Peel's establishment were occupied by a pair of freighters Jeremiah knew by sight and by 2 men from the county assessor's office. All 4 of them glanced at Augusta with varying degrees of curiosity. One of the freighters, a large man named Cord, leaned toward his partner and said something in a low voice that made his partner laugh. Jeremiah set down his spoon. Augusta, who had heard the remark, he could tell by the slight stiffening in her posture, did not look at them. She picked up her coffee and looked at Jeremiah instead, and there was something in her expression that said clearly, "Don't." He held her gaze and picked his spoon back up. After a moment, she said, at a normal conversational volume that carried perfectly well to the freighter's table, "I'm going to need to speak to Mr. Holt again about the access road onto the Dawson parcel. The eastern approach has a drainage issue that might complicate things in the spring thaw." She looked at him with calm eyes. "Do you know that stretch of road?" "I do," he said. "Would you be willing to look at it with me before we ride back?" "Yes," he said. And they talked about drainage and spring thaw and access roads, and by the time they left Mrs. Peel's establishment, the freighters were paying attention to their own stew, and Augusta walked out ahead of Jeremiah with her back straight and her head up and her newly purchased Wyoming coat buttoned to the collar. Outside on the boardwalk, Jeremiah settled his hat and said, "You could have let me say something." "You didn't need to say anything," she said. "Neither did I. You handled that well," he said. She looked at him, and her amber eyes had a spark of something fierce in them. "I've been handling things like that for 29 years, she said. "I don't need rescuing from ignorant men. What I need is people who see that I'm capable and let me demonstrate it." She paused, and then the fierceness softened just slightly. "Which you've done. So thank you." He held her gaze, and something moved in him, something warm and uncomplicated and completely out of practice, rising up through 7 years of careful suppression like a creek rising under the spring melt. "You're welcome," he said. They rode back to the Turner Ranch in the early afternoon because the road would be harder going in the dark and the temperature would drop sharply. The ride back was quieter than the ride in. The conversation had not run out. He didn't have the sense that conversation with Augusta Grady ever ran out, but the silence between them had changed again, had taken on a new quality, and he was aware of her presence beside him in the cold afternoon with a specificity that he had not been aware of anyone's presence in a very long time. At the gate of his ranch, she pulled the bay mare up and he pulled up beside her. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "The Dawson parcel cabin," she said. "I know it's been empty for 2 years. The letter from Mr. Holt mentioned it was in livable condition, but I suspect that's a liberal use of the word livable. It needs work," he said carefully. "It's structurally sound, but the chimney needs repointing and there are 2 windows that are damaged." She looked at him. "How bad is it truly?" "You can live in it," he said, "but not in December, not until those repairs are made." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the gate. "I could offer you the spare room," he said. His voice was level, his eyes on the middle distance. "Until the cabin is weather-tight. It wouldn't take more than a week, maybe 10 days if the weather holds. Chayton and I could do the repairs." She turned to look at him. "That's too much to ask of you," she said. "You didn't ask," he said. "I offered." She looked at him for a long moment, and in the cold afternoon light with the snow all around and the mountains behind him, he held her gaze and let her read whatever she needed to read in his face, because he was a man who had forgotten how to dissemble and had never been particularly good at it anyway. "All right," she said quietly. "Yes, thank you." They rode through the gate together. Over the next 9 days, Jeremiah Turner repaired the Dawson cabin. He went over every morning with Chayton, and they worked through the cold days with methodical determination, repointing the chimney, replacing the broken windows with new glass ordered from Dunnigan's, reinforcing the porch boards, checking and sealing the roof. It was good work, honest and physical and satisfying in the way that fixing things always was, and Augusta came with them each day and worked alongside them without being asked to, proving within the first hour of the first day that she was not there to supervise. She hauled water. She mixed mortar. She climbed onto the porch roof without hesitation when the shingles needed examining and identified 3 that were loose before either of them had gotten up there to look. She worked in the Wyoming cold with her jaw set, and her breath coming in white puffs and her gloved hands moving with purpose. And by the end of the first day, Chayton had looked at Jeremiah with an expression that said, plainly, that he approved. In the evenings they returned to Jeremiah's house. Augusta cooked, or they cooked together, which happened increasingly as the days went on, him at the stove, her at the table, the work of food preparation distributed between them in the easy, unspoken negotiation of people who have become genuinely comfortable with each other. Chayton ate with them twice that week, which was unusual. He ordinarily ate alone in the bunkhouse, and the three of them sat around Jeremiah's kitchen table in the lamplight and ate, and talked about the work and the weather and the horses and the land. On the fourth evening, after Chayton had gone and the dishes were done, Augusta sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and Jeremiah sat across from her with the accounts book he'd been meaning to update for 2 weeks, and they worked in companionable silence for an hour, and it was the most domestic and natural hour Jeremiah Turner had spent in 7 years, and it frightened him slightly, and he sat with the fright and did not act on it. On the 6th day, something happened that shifted everything. They were at the cabin, working on the interior, cleaning out the years of accumulated dust and mouse nests and general abandonment, when a man rode up the access road on a rangy gray horse. He was perhaps 45, heavy in the face, wearing a good coat that had seen better days, and he looked at the cabin, and at the 2 people and the young Lakota man working outside it with the expression of someone who felt he had a legitimate claim to be annoyed. His name, it turned out, was Warren Gibbs. He was the neighbor to the south of the Dawson parcel, now the Grady parcel, and he explained with barely managed hostility, made an offer to purchase the Dawson land last year, and had been waiting on an answer from Frank Dawson's estate. The land sold through the Territorial Land Office, Augusta told him. She was standing outside the cabin door with her arms at her sides, and her voice was pleasant but had iron in it. The transaction is complete and the deed is recorded. I own this property. You're a woman, Gibbs said, as though that were a counter-argument. I am aware of that, Augusta said. The land office is also aware of it. They recorded the deed regardless. This land should have come to a ranching man, Gibbs said. I've been working this territory for 15 years. A woman alone, no offense meant, has no business trying to run a horse operation on 40 acres with nothing but nerve and a notebook. Jeremiah had stopped working at some point in the previous minute. He was standing at the corner of the cabin with a pry bar in his hand, and he was looking at Warren Gibbs with a calm, flat expression that Chayton, who had also stopped working, recognized and responded to by putting down his tools and standing up straight. Miss Grady, Jeremiah said, has more knowledge of horse breeding and land management than most men who have been ranching twice as long as Gibbs, and the land is hers, legally and completely. So this conversation is finished. Gibbs looked at him. Something shifted in the man's expression when he registered Jeremiah's tone, not quite backing down but recalculating. Turner, Gibbs said, after a pause. I didn't know you had an interest in this. I'm her neighbor, Jeremiah said. That's my interest. Gibbs looked between the 2 of them and then at the cabin, and something resolved in his face into a lower-grade hostility, the kind a man adopts when he's decided to be difficult over time rather than directly confrontational now. We'll see how it goes, Gibbs said, which was not a threat exactly but was not a threat. He turned his horse and rode back down the access road. Augusta stood watching him go. When he had passed out of sight, she turned and looked at Jeremiah. Thank you, she said, but I could have handled that. I know you could, he said. I wasn't doing it because you couldn't. I was doing it because I wanted to. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely decode, something warm and wary at the same time, like she was feeling something she hadn't decided yet what to do with. That's different, she said after a moment. Yes, he said. It is. They went back to work. On the 8th day, the chimney was done and the windows were in, and the worst of the interior had been cleaned, and the porch was solid. The cabin was, by any honest measure, livable in the Wyoming December sense, which meant it was sound against the wind and the cold and would hold a fire properly. On the evening of the 8th day, Augusta came to Jeremiah in the main room where he was reading by the fire. She stood in the doorway. "The cabin is ready," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should move in tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said again without looking up from the page. She was quiet for a moment. He turned the page. He was not reading a word on it. "Jeremiah," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked up. She was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, not defensively, but in the way a person stands when they are trying to hold themselves steady against something they're feeling. And her amber eyes were on his with a directness that he had come to know, over these 8 days, was simply the truest expression of who she was. "I don't want to misread things," she said, carefully. "And I don't want to put either of us in a position that becomes difficult. But I think, and I might be wrong, and if I am you should tell me plainly, that something has been developing between us these past days that is not nothing." He set down the book. He looked at her across the fire-lit room. 7 years of silence. 7 years of doing the necessary thing and living inside the necessary circumference and not wanting, not hoping, because those were the kinds of things that cost too much when they didn't arrive. "You're not wrong," he said. She held his gaze and he held hers, and neither of them moved for a moment. "I need to be honest with you about something," he said. "I'm not a man who is practiced at this. What I feel slowly. I don't say things I don't mean. But I also don't always." He stopped and tried again. "What I mean to say is that I am not good at being easy. I am good at being steady." She looked at him, and he thought he saw the faintest trembling at the corners of her mouth. Not amusement exactly, but something close to tenderness. "I don't need easy," she said. "I need real." The fire crackled. He stood up from the chair and crossed the room to the doorway where she stood, and he stopped close enough to her that he could see the exact color of her eyes in the firelight, which was amber shot through with darker streaks of brown and gold, and he said, "Then we're working with the same material." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. Her hand was warm from the fire. His jaw was rough with 3 days of beard as usual, because he had not thought to shave. He stood very still. "You could have told me to leave at any point," she said. "Any of the 3 times you had a reason to, and you didn't." "No," he said. "I didn't." She rose up on her toes and kissed him softly, the way someone reaches for something they've been thinking about for some time and have now decided to stop thinking about and simply do. He put his hands on her shoulders and kissed her back, and it was the most human thing he had done in 7 years, the most vulnerable, the most real, and it cost him something and gave him something at the same time, which was, he thought, how it was supposed to work. When she stepped back, her eyes were bright. "All right," she said quietly. "All right," he said. She moved to the cabin the next day as planned. He helped her carry her things, which were still not many, the small leather bag plus the supplies she'd bought in town, across the snow to the Dawson cabin, which he would learn to call, slowly and then naturally, the Grady cabin. She made it her own within a week with a thoroughness that impressed him. She was not a woman who required a great deal to build a home, but what she used with intention. He came every day. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes both. It was not difficult to justify. They shared a fence line between his south pasture and her north boundary, and there was always legitimate reason to ride that way. But they stopped pretending between themselves that the reason was entirely practical. He taught her the particular management rhythms of Wyoming winters, the things that weren't in any letter from any land office, the things you could only know by having lived through them, which water sources froze in what order, which winds meant snow was coming and which were just wind, the way the horses behaved in the 3 days before a serious storm. She absorbed everything and added it to the notebook, and asked follow-up questions 2 days later that showed she had thought about it in between, which was both useful and enjoyable in a way he had not expected information exchange to be enjoyable. She began visiting his ranch in the evening sometimes, and not always because he invited her. She would simply appear at the kitchen door as the light was failing, which meant she had ridden over in the cold for no reason that needed stating. And he would open the door and she would come in and take off her coat, and they would eat together and sit by the fire and talk. And sometimes they talked about the ranch, and sometimes they talked about things that had nothing to do with anything practical at all. She told him about Ohio, about her father, a taciturn, broad-handed man named Albert who had loved his family as well as he knew how and had taught Augusta to ride and to read and to think for herself, and had then, in a well-meaning but ultimately misguided act of love, tried to set her up in a conventional domestic life that she had spent the rest of her adult years quietly refusing. She told him about the trip west to Kansas, the wagon road, the way the country had opened up past the Mississippi into something that felt, to a 23-year-old woman sitting on a wagon seat with the wind in her face, like an exhalation. He told her things he had not told anyone. About the early years of the ranch with Margaret, when they'd been so young and so poor and so utterly undaunted by the poverty that it seemed in retrospect like a kind of blessed stupidity, the particular immunity to difficulty that comes from not having enough experience to know how difficult the difficulty actually is. About the first winter, which nearly killed him not with cold but with the catastrophic loneliness of being a man in an enormous and indifferent landscape, and how Margaret had stood in the doorway of their first rough cabin with her hands on her hips and said, "You can be lonely or you can be useful. Pick one." He told her about the evening he had found Margaret fallen in the yard, already sick, already feverish, and the sick knowledge that had hit him in the stomach before he reached her that something serious had begun. Augusta listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, which was the quality of someone who genuinely wanted to know, not out of curiosity but out of care. "She sounds like someone who made a mark on everything she touched," Augusta said one evening by the fire. "She did," he said. "Do you think?" Augusta paused, and he could see her choosing her words with care, not being timid about it but being honest about it, which was different. "Do you think she would have another pause? I'm asking this genuinely, not to hear a comfortable answer. Whether she would have approved of you," he said. "Yes." He looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he looked at Augusta. "She would have respected you immediately," he said. "She had very little patience for anything that wasn't genuine, and she would have liked the fact that you showed up on my porch in a blizzard and then swept my floor without being asked." He paused. "Whether she would have wanted me to." He found the exact right words. "She used to say that grief was the price of love, and that anyone who had paid it was a fool not to spend again." Augusta looked at him and he thought she might say something, but she didn't. She just reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a long while, watching the fire. January moved into February. Augusta's first horse arrived, a 3-year-old paint stallion she had purchased, after extensive correspondence, from a breeder in Laramie, who delivered him in a cold snap in the last week of January, and looked faintly doubtful about leaving an animal of that quality with a woman rancher alone, until Augusta walked into the pen and handled the paint with such obvious competence that the man's doubtfulness converted into something closer to respect. She named the stallion Prospero. He was a spectacular animal, 16 hands, deep-chested, with an intelligence in his eyes that was almost inconvenient in its intensity. Jeremiah rode over the morning after the delivery and stood at the fence of the pen she'd built from cedar rail and looked at the stallion with genuine admiration. "That's a fine horse," he said. "He is," Augusta agreed, standing beside him at the fence. "He's the beginning." "What's the plan?" he asked, though he already knew the broad outline. 3 mares by spring," she said. "I've identified 2 from the Laramie breeder and 1 from a man in Rawlins. If I get 2 good foals by next autumn, I can begin establishing the bloodline in this region. The cavalry contract office in Cheyenne is accepting applications from new breeders." She paused. "I've submitted 1. He turned his head to look at her. "Already?" She met his eyes with the small, fierce smile he had come to know and love in equal measure. "I don't wait," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't." He said it with a warmth that he knew was visible, and he did not try to make it invisible. February was the cold month, the one that tested everything, men and animals and structures and intentions, and they both worked through it with their heads down and their hands busy. He doubled his morning rides past her fence line. She appeared at his kitchen door more evenings than not. They argued once about the proper management of a sick calf. Her reading of the animal's condition was different from his, and she said so plainly, and he disagreed just as plainly. And after 15 minutes of genuine disagreement and a careful examination of the evidence on all sides, they determined that she was right and adjusted accordingly, and the calf recovered, and neither of them made a great deal of the outcome beyond what it warranted. He respected her more for having argued the point. She seemed to understand that he respected her more, and there was something satisfying in that for both of them. Warren Gibbs appeared twice more in February. The first time was at Augusta's fence line, making noise about a shared drainage issue that he claimed was her responsibility to resolve a claim that Jeremiah, who knew the legal position of the property boundary, told him clearly and calmly was without foundation. The second time was at the Harrow Creek Town Council meeting, where Gibbs raised the question of whether a single-woman landowner could be expected to uphold the maintenance obligations for the access road. Augusta Grady attended the meeting and addressed the council herself. She brought the deed documentation, the relevant territorial statute regarding access road maintenance, and a hand-drawn survey she had done herself of the road condition. And she demolished Gibbs's argument so thoroughly and so politely that the council chairman spent most of his response time simply agreeing with her. Jeremiah sat in the back of the room and watched and felt something in his chest that was uncomplicated and clean and warm, and he let himself feel it fully because he was getting better by degrees at not suppressing things that deserved to exist. Afterward, on the cold street outside the town hall, Augusta pulled her Wyoming coat tighter and looked up at him with bright eyes and said, "That was enormously satisfying." "It was excellent," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, full, and it was the best sound he had heard in 7 years, and he told himself he would hear it every day for the rest of his life if he was given any choice in the matter at all, which was when he knew. Not that he had been uncertain exactly. But knowing is different from feeling. He had been feeling it for weeks, since the first evening by the fire, since Augusta, perhaps since the moment he opened his door to the storm and found her standing there in her inadequate coat with her blue-tipped fingers, looking at him as though she had decided already to trust him and was simply waiting to see whether that decision was going to prove correct. He knew. March came with mud and warmth and the first pale suggestion of green under the snowmelt along the creek banks. Augusta's 3 mares arrived, 2 paints and a bay, all of them sound and well-formed, and Prospero greeted his new companions with the authority of a stallion who had decided very quickly that this was his territory. The horse operation was beginning in earnest. Jeremiah came over to help her settle the new animals, and they spent the afternoon working together in the pen, the mud up to their boot tops, and at one point Augusta lost her footing on a slick patch and grabbed his arm to steady herself, and he caught her with both hands, and she was laughing before she'd finished falling, her eyes bright with the humor of it, and he held her upright and looked at her and said, without having planned to say it, "Marry me." She stopped laughing. She looked up at him. His hands were still on her arms, and she was still half-tilted from catching her balance, and the mud was all around them, and Prospero was watching them over the fence rail with his large dark eyes. "Jeremiah," she said, "I'm not a man who says things he hasn't thought through," he said, "and I've thought this through for weeks. I'm not asking because of the snow or the convenience of the situation or any reason that would make it less than what it is. I'm asking because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life being steady for you." He paused. "And because you're the only person I've met since Margaret who makes the silence of this place feel like enough." She looked at him for a long moment, and the bright eyes had gone wet, though she was not a woman who cried easily, and he knew that, and the fact that her eyes were bright made something ache in him with tenderness. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while and I've been—" She stopped and took a breath. "You are a difficult man to read sometimes. You keep so much very still." "I'm working on it," he said. "I know you are," she said. "I've watched you work on it." "Augusta," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him, amber eyes, strong jaw, mud on her boots, everything she was and had been and was becoming, standing in the March mud in Wyoming territory holding his hands, and she said, "Yes, of course I will." He pulled her in and held her, her face against his shoulder, and he stood in the spring mud of the Grady ranch with his arms around her, and felt the ground under his feet as though he were standing on it for the first time, as though some part of him had been hovering, suspended, for 7 years, and had only just now come down. The circuit preacher, a gray-templed man named Reverend Alton who had known Jeremiah for 6 years, and who had presided over more frontier weddings than he could accurately count, came through Harrow Creek in the second week of April. Jeremiah had sent a letter ahead to ask him to perform the ceremony, and Alton arrived with his Bible and his sun-battered hat and shook Jeremiah's hand with genuine, uncomplicated warmth and turned to Augusta with a formal bow. "I was not certain," Alton said to Jeremiah in a quiet aside before the ceremony, "that I would ever be doing this for you." "Neither was I," Jeremiah said honestly. "God has a different plan than we think," Alton said, which was the kind of thing Jeremiah did not entirely know how to respond to, so he nodded with what he hoped was appropriate gravity. They were married in the doorway of the Turner Ranch house, with the April Wyoming sky enormous above them, and the first wildflowers pushing through the greening grass at the edge of the porch, with Chayton standing to Jeremiah's left and Ben Dunnigan and his wife Clara standing to Augusta's right, and Mrs. Peel from the eating house who had ridden out because she had heard there was a wedding, and she had liked Augusta Grady from the first time she came into the place and ordered pie. Reverend Alton read the service and Augusta spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, and Jeremiah spoke his with his eyes on hers, and his voice rough with something he wasn't ashamed of. When Alton said he might kiss his bride, Jeremiah cupped Augusta's face in his rough, work-marked hands and kissed her, while the small collection of witnesses cheered and Clara Dunnigan cried into her handkerchief. Afterward they ate the food Mrs. Peel had brought in baskets, cold chicken and cornbread and apple preserves, and a cake that was inexplicably excellent given the circumstances of its transport on the porch of the Turner Ranch house in the April sun. And Chayton sat with them and ate a piece of cake, and looked at the two of them with an expression that was as close to pleased as Chayton ever visibly got, which was to say it was slight and genuine and entirely legible if you knew him. Dunnigan raised his tin cup and said, "To Jeremiah Turner and Augusta Grady Turner, God willing and the creek don't rise." They drank. Augusta put her hand in Jeremiah's under the table and kept it there. The question of where they would live was settled practically and without drama, as most things between them were. The Turner Ranch house was larger and more established, and the operations of both properties needed to be managed together in any case, so they would live in the ranch house and Augusta would continue the horse breeding program on the Grady parcel with a shared fence line and shared labor. It was not a romantic solution exactly, but it was a good one, and both of them were people who knew that a good solution was better than a romantic one. Augusta moved her things into the ranch house on a Saturday in late April. It was not a large operation. She was still not a woman who required a great deal, but the moving of her things changed the house in ways that were both practical and something more than practical. A second coffee cup on the shelf, a third quilt on the bed. The small writing desk she'd had Dunnigan order from the catalog, which she set in front of the window in the room that had been the spare bedroom and which became her office, its surface covered within a week in her precise handwriting breeding records, supply accounts, correspondence with the cavalry contract office, letters to horse breeders across the territory. The house felt different. He walked into a room one evening in May and simply stood there for a moment, feeling the difference, and it was not the difference of having been lonely and now being not lonely. It was something larger and more specific than that. It was the difference between a life that was carefully maintained and a life that was being lived. He found her in the kitchen that evening, and she looked up from the book she was reading and said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Just looking at you." She gave him the small, fierce smile and looked back at her book. He sat down across the table and picked up his accounts, and they spent the evening together in the lamplight, and it was the best ordinary evening of his life. Prospero proved himself in the spring, and the first foals arrived in late summer, 2 colts from the Paint mares, both of them strong and well-formed. Augusta's application to the cavalry contract office had been responded to with interest, and a man from the office came out in August to look at the operation, rode the bay mare around the Grady parcel, with the focused attention of someone who was actually evaluating the quality of the program rather than simply going through the motions, and left with a provisional contract for 6 horses per year. Warren Gibbs had not given them any trouble since March. He had apparently recalculated at some point during the winter that Augusta Grady, now Augusta Turner, was not going anywhere, and that the Grady operation was not going to fail, and had adjusted accordingly. He was not friendly, but he was no longer actively hostile, and in the particular ecosystem of neighboring ranches in Wyoming territory, that was close enough to peace. Chayton, for his part, had absorbed the change in the household with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He and Augusta had developed an efficient working partnership that occasionally, to Jeremiah's private amusement, left him the least informed person on a particular horse management question because they had already worked it out between themselves. He did not mind this. He minded it exactly 0. In the autumn of 1886, Augusta told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, in the direct way she told him everything. She had been watching him as she spoke, and he understood that she was braced for whatever he would show her, which probably meant she was more nervous about this than she had seemed. He crossed the kitchen to her in 3 steps and held her, and the feeling that moved through him was so large and so complicated that he couldn't have named it with any accuracy: joy, yes, and fear in the honest way that anyone who has loved and lost carries fear, and something that was almost reverence. "All right," he said in her hair. "All right," she repeated, muffled against his shoulder. "All right," he said again. "We'll be fine. You'll be fine. All of this will be fine." She pulled back enough to look at him, and he could see that her amber eyes were bright again in that particular way, the way that meant something was moving in her that she wasn't fully managing, and she said, "You'd better be sure of that." "I'm sure," he said. "I'm not always sure of things, but I'm sure of that." She held his gaze for a moment, assessing him the way she assessed everything for quality and soundness, and then she nodded. "Good," she said. The winter of 1886 was a difficult one across the Wyoming territory. Historians would later call it one of the worst in recorded memory, with temperatures dropping to levels that killed cattle by the thousands across the range, and tested every ranching operation in the territory to its structural limits. Jeremiah and Chayton worked through it with everything they had, losing 7 head from the cattle herd in the worst week of January, but saving the rest through sheer relentlessness. Augusta, who was 5 months pregnant by January and could not do the heaviest outdoor work, managed the records and the supply calculations and the correspondence with the cattle buyers in Cheyenne, and kept their financial position as stable as it could be kept in the conditions. And her management of those accounts during that winter was, in Jeremiah's honest assessment, the thing that saved them from the kind of losses that ended some operations that year. He told her so plainly, and she looked at him with her pencil in her hand and said, "Of course it was," with a warmth in her voice that took the edge off the immodesty. He laughed, a full, genuine laugh, which was something he did with increasing regularity now, something Augusta had apparently decided was part of her mandate. And she smiled at him across the table with those amber eyes, and everything was exactly as it should be. Their son was born in March of 1887, in the ranch house, with a capable midwife named Mrs. Vargas from Harrow Creek attending and Jeremiah in the room at Augusta's absolute insistence, because she had told him plainly that if he thought she was going through that alone while he waited on the other side of a door, he had another thing coming. He stayed. He would have stayed anyway. The boy was born just after dawn, strong-voiced and dark-haired like his father, and Augusta held him against her chest and looked at him with an expression of such complete absorption that Jeremiah stood at the edge of the bed and watched her and felt the particular, enormous, terrifying love that comes from looking at a person you love looking at something they love, and understanding that the world has just gotten bigger and deeper and more irreversible in the best possible way. What shall we call him? Augusta said. You choose, Jeremiah said. She looked up at him. His middle name should be Albert, she said, after my father. Yes, he said immediately. He thought for a moment. And his first name, she looked at the baby. William, she said. William Albert Turner. William for no particular reason except that it's a strong name and he looks strong. He does, Jeremiah said, and reached down and touched his son's dark hair with one careful finger. He looks like he's planning something. Augusta laughed, tired and luminous in herself all the way through, even in the first morning of her son's life. And the sound of her laugh in the room with the new spring light coming through the window was the sound of a life that was full. Chayton came to the back door at mid-morning and was told the news through the door by Jeremiah, and his voice when he responded had something in it that was genuine and warm and unsuppressed. A boy, Chayton said. A boy, Jeremiah confirmed. A pause. Then Chayton said, Congratulations, Jeremiah. He had never used his given name before. Jeremiah noticed it and valued it for what it was, which was a gift from a young man who did not give them carelessly. Thank you, Jeremiah said. Come in. Have breakfast with us. William Turner was 6 months old when Augusta began corresponding with the Cheyenne Cavalry Office about expanding the contract, and 8 months old when she and Jeremiah rode together to inspect a second parcel of land that had come available on the east side of the creek, adjacent to the Grady parcel, which they decided together to purchase and fold into the horse operation. William, by this point, was accustomed to being carried in a blanket wrap against Augusta's chest while she moved around the property, and he had already developed the focused, observational gaze of both his parents, which made Chayton say once, completely seriously, that the baby looked like he was taking notes. Jeremiah Turner was 36 years old in the spring of 1888, and he was a man who had been broken and had rebuilt himself, and had then been rebuilt again, differently and better, by the arrival of a woman in a blizzard who had knocked on his door with blue-tipped fingers and an unflinching amber gaze and a leather bag and 40 acres, and no intention of being anyone other than exactly who she was. He thought about this sometimes, in the mornings before the rest of the house was awake, sitting in the kitchen with his first coffee of the day, the Wyoming sky going from black to purple to gold outside the window. He thought about the shape of those 7 years, what they had cost him, what they had made him, the specific kind of steadiness that can only be built from having held yourself together through something you were not entirely certain you could survive. And he thought about the night the knock came, and how close he had been to not opening the door, not because he would have left a person in danger in a storm, but because there had been a half-second of hesitation, a half-second of the fortress walls going up, before the sound of her voice had cut right through them. He was glad every morning that he had opened the door. Augusta appeared in the kitchen doorway in her wool robe with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and he had been married to her for 2 years, and the sight of her still made something in his chest respond the way it always had, which was with a warmth and a sharpness that he had decided to stop being surprised by and simply be grateful for. "You're up early," she said, as she had said on the first morning in his kitchen, and her eyes were warm with the same private recognition. "I'm always up early," he said, which was what she had said in answer, and she smiled the full smile, not the small fierce one, the real one, and came to the kitchen and poured herself coffee and sat across from him, William slept through, she said. I heard, he said. You were listening. I'm always listening, he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning light, with the steam rising from her coffee and the Wyoming Territory sky going gold beyond the window, and she said, I want to tell you something. He set down his cup and waited. I know you remember every day what it cost you, she said, carefully and directly, as she always spoke. The years before. And I know it is not something that goes away. And I want you to know that I would never want you to pretend that it isn't there. What you loved and what you lost, she held his eyes. But I also want you to know that what we have here, what we've made, it is the best thing I have ever been a part of. It is the most myself I have ever been. She paused. You made room for me, completely. And I know what that cost you, and I don't ever want to forget to say thank you for it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You knocked on my door in a blizzard and swept my floor without being asked and argued with me about a calf and bought 40 acres and made my house make sense again. I think we're even. She looked at him and the amber eyes were bright and she laughed, and the sound of her laugh filled the kitchen. And William made a sound from his cradle in the next room that was either a response to the laugh or a declaration of his own intention to be part of whatever was happening. And Jeremiah Turner stood from his chair and went to his son and picked him up and brought him back to the kitchen and sat back down with the boy on his knee. And Augusta reached across and put her hand over his. And the three of them sat in the gold morning light of Wyoming, while the fire came up on the stove and the day began. That summer, Augusta wrote her name on a second contract with the cavalry office, this one for 12 horses per year, which was double the first and which represented, as she told Jeremiah with the careful understatement of a person who does not jinx things, a solid foundation. Prospero's bloodline was establishing itself in the territory with a reputation for soundness and quality that was beginning to draw buyers from as far as Colorado. Chayton had taken on the role of head ranch hand, with a formality that had never been discussed, but that had simply solidified over time, and Jeremiah had increased his pay accordingly and given him a more permanent arrangement with the property that both of them understood as the long-term situation it was. Warren Gibbs had sold his parcel in late summer and moved to Colorado, which solved a problem without anyone having to do anything about it, and the new neighbor to the south, a young couple named Fletcher, newly arrived from Missouri with more optimism than experience but a willingness to learn, had come over within the first week to introduce themselves, and Augusta had invited them to dinner without ceremony. And by the end of the evening, had given Mrs. Fletcher a list of every practical thing she had needed to know and hadn't known when she arrived in Wyoming Territory, which Mrs. Fletcher received with the gratitude of someone who had been wandering in a dark room and has just been handed a lamp. On the evening that the Fletchers rode back to their place, Jeremiah said to Augusta, You've been in Wyoming for 2 years and you're already the most useful person in this county. I'm making investments, she said simply. In what? She looked at him with her amber eyes in the lamplight. In the people who'll be my neighbors for the next 40 years, she said. In the community I'm going to raise my children in. She paused and then with a careful, private smile added, My children. He looked at her. She met his eyes. Another one, he said. If I'm reading the signs correctly, she said. Though I'd rather wait another few weeks to be certain before I tell William he's going to have a sibling. He won't understand you if you tell him, Jeremiah said. He's 14 months old. He understands more than you think, she said, with the absolute certainty of a woman who has made a careful study of her son. Jeremiah reached across and put his hand against her face, and she leaned into it the way she always did, just slightly, the barely perceptible lean of someone who has learned, not entirely easily, to accept warmth without flinching from it. Are you happy? He asked her. It was not a question he asked often, because he was generally a man who observed rather than asked. But he asked it now. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm the most at home I have ever been in my life, she said, and I think that's the truest answer I know how to give. He understood that. He held her face in his rough hand and looked at her and understood it completely, because it was precisely what he would have said himself if he were a man who was any better at finding the right words. He had been many things in his life: a rancher, a widower, a man who lived inside silence and made it work, a man who opened a door in a blizzard because someone needed him to, but he had never until now, not since the best and 2 brief years before the fever took Margaret, been at home in his own life. He was at home now. They sat together in the lamplight while the summer night came down over the Wyoming range, and the horses moved peacefully in their pasture, and William slept soundly in his room, and the second Turner child, not yet known and not yet named, began the long, slow work of becoming. And the house around them was full of the specific warmth of a life being lived by people who had found their way to each other through grief and blizzards and stubbornness. And 40 acres of Wyoming land and a knock on a door in the middle of the night that Jeremiah Turner had answered without knowing that everything was about to change. He would answer it 1,000 times. He had answered it once, and it had been enough. The second child was a girl, born in the following spring, round-cheeked and already showing signs of her mother's amber eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. And they named her Clara Margaret Turner, Clara for Mrs. Dunnigan, who had cried at the wedding and had been a good friend to Augusta in the years since, and Margaret for the woman who had broken this ground first, who had stood in the Wyoming cold and built something with Jeremiah Turner before the fever came, and who deserved to be remembered in the name of something that was going to grow and live and thrive. Augusta held Clara on the evening of her first day and looked at the name they had chosen together. It had been Augusta who suggested Margaret, quietly, watching Jeremiah's face as she said it, and she said, "She'll know who she was named for. I'll make sure of it." "I know you will," Jeremiah said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife holding their daughter in the evening light, and William was asleep in the next room, having been put down with considerable effort by Chayton, who had discovered to his own apparent surprise that he was good with the boy, and the ranch outside was quiet, and the horses were settled, and the Wyoming sky was that particular blue that it only is in the spring evenings, deep and clear and enormous. 7 years of silence. One knock on a door. Augusta Grady, with her blue-tipped fingers and her amber eyes and her leather bag and her 40 acres and her absolute, unshakable, magnificent self. Jeremiah Turner looked at his family in the lamplight of the house he had built with his hands and his grief and his stubbornness, and he felt the fullness of it, the complete, irreversible, breathing fullness of a life that had room in it for everything, for loss and for love, and for the children who would carry both forward, for the woman who had not been defeated by a blizzard or an empty cabin or ignorant men or the long, lonely work of building something from nothing in a territory that asked everything of you, for the land under the snow and the horses in the pasture and the creek running dark and fast in the spring thaw and the mountains to the west going pink in the evening light. For all of it, every ordinary and extraordinary piece of it. He put his arm around Augusta's shoulders and she leaned into him and Clara slept between them and the house held them all, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.